Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Loop and Learn's T1D speaker series. This is an unusual event for us. We had a tremendous panel discussion a few days ago on Loop versus Omnipod 5, and there were so many questions in the chat that we were not able to get to them in 90 minutes of discussion. So we're back with Jon Fawcett, Matthew Kitchin, Tina Hammer, and Britni Schipper to answer your questions. So just once again, just a quick screenshot of who you'll be hearing from, what their background is, and why you should listen to these people. They have a lot to say. Thank you all for joining in, and I'm going to turn this over to Tina right now. Thanks, Tina.
Thank you, Joanne. Welcome, everybody. We had a huge number of questions in the chat, questions and comments. And so in looking through those, we decided to go through them in this format and try to do some justice to answering some of those, because the goal is to help explain it better. And I'm going to start by asking a question, and somebody just answer, and we'll keep moving. The term stupid smart came out in our discussion, and somebody said that they appreciate the term stupid smart and would like to understand the bounds of the algorithm anyway. Do you know that how the maximum basal adjustments are calculated?
Yeah,
I'll take that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the algorithm calculates an adaptive basal rate that's essentially your TDI, total daily insulin, divided by 48. So at any time you can look at that, and that's on the top of the history screen, and divide that by 48, and then the maximum it can dose is going to be 4 times that. So if you split that out into 5-minute segments and look at your automated history, you'll see that that's a maximum of 4 times that hourly rate spread out across 5 minutes.
John, can you just briefly explain the adaptive model?
Well, it's just that it's almost continuously calculating what it thinks basal is based on your TDI. And as we mentioned before, it uses the last 3 or 4 pods of TDI to sort of get this aggregated average. So we don't know their proprietary sauce is how they weight those last approximately week and a half of pods, and then determine what to use for the current pod. But whatever they determine out of your TDI sort of average over the last 4 pods, that's what your current pod is going to be using for its adaptive basal, and then just divide by 48. And your maximum will be 4 times that.
Great, thank you.
Okay. All right. My understanding is the low target O5 uses is 110. Is this true, or is it sometimes made lower?
110 is the lowest target that you can possibly set on the system. There's nothing lower. Doesn't mean that you're going to stay at 110. You can absolutely run a lower blood sugar than 110. We sat in the 80s all night last night with a target of 110, but it's that's the lowest you can set it on the system.
And I think all of us have had that experience where it's, the 110 is more of is the target, to aim at, not the target to stay at necessarily.
Right. My normal target in Loop, I think it's 95 to 105, but didn't mean that's where I was, and I'm getting a better average blood sugar in 05.
I like to think of it at like a dial of N is the most aggressive that you can be, and then you can turn it to 120, 130, 140, 150, and then the absolute. Because not only is it targeting the 150, but it also cuts back on the amount of insulin that it's delivering. So like you can use that dial to help you in certain situations when the system is being more aggressive because of that. Maybe you had more TDI due to illness or hormones or whatever it is that's going on, and you want it to be just a little bit less aggressive. You can go ahead and crank that target up to be able to help achieve lack of lows, essentially.
And it's a pretty gentle way to do it, and an easy on the brain too.
Yep.
We are struggling with post-meal spikes for a 2-year-old. Do you have any estimates on how much to kick up the carb ratio?
I'm going to do some math on what ours changed by.
Is this implying, from switching to Omnipod 5 or just a general Omnipod 5 question, do we think?
I think it's probably general.
Okay.
There's not an indicator, but
Right.
they didn't
So,
say that they switched. Just
my
switched.
daughter's got 25% more aggressive. Now that might not be true for everybody. I don't know if you guys have an idea of what yours changed by, but that's what ours was, and it seems to be holding pretty close to that.
Yeah,
That sounds about consistent with what we did. But again, everybody is going to be different based upon how correct or incorrect your settings were when heading into the system. So that's like a really difficult, you can't quantify that for everybody. It's going to be a lot of trial and error to identify what the right amount is.
Plus, I think with sensitivity changes that we all see sometimes, that can complicate it. Okay, here's a big one. Tips for choosing settings coming from Loop to O5 would be greatly appreciated.
Because this is what I hear all the time is I would never do O5 because my target can only be 110. Even in Sunday night's discussion, after John discussed it and Matthew discussed it, there were comments in chat about, well, I would never change because of that range. It comes from adults, either parents who want their kids to have the best numbers so that they live a perfectly healthy and complication-free life, or adults who are going, no, 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 I don't want that. Can you make that a little clearer to people?
I think Brittany phrased it really well when she said it's kind of like a dial of aggressiveness. The higher the number, the less aggressive it is.
But people,
again, it's one.
People want
110 doesn't mean you sit there. Like it's what it's using to help make that decision on what to and not to do. But it's still going to dose insulin. When you're below that, like it's not shutting things off simply because you're at target. If it is, it means your other settings are wrong.
I'm gonna share a screen just again real quick if nobody minds. Be quick here. Share. So, for me, it's more about the results than what you did to get, why. And so I don't care what the target was actually set to, but those are the results that matter to me. And so I thought the same thing, going back to the tandem closed loop solution. I was like, oh, never do that, too high. But if it's your target's 110, but you're a little more aggressive than getting there, you're gonna hit down into the 90s and come back up to around 100. And so yeah, I understand. I think I had that concern at first, but not at all for me. Not a concern.
And I would just encourage those people. This is a great example of what's going through my head is if your loop target is under 110, Matthew, you said yours was 95 to 105 usually.
Yeah.
Well, if you're setting a target, say 100 or even 95 in loop, if your A1C isn't 5, you're not hitting that as an average. So your blood sugar is going up and down. The target, like Matthew said, isn't really relevant. It's the result of that target. So take a look at your A1C, your time in range, standard deviation, and a 110 can get you into the low 5s for A1C, into the 90s for time in range, and I've seen people in the 20s and less for standard deviation.
Yep. And you got 4 examples right here of that.
Our last A1C was 5.6 on OP5.
So amazing.
For a 6-year-old.
For a 6-year-old,
Yeah.
lowest A1C we've had.
So maybe the advice is that's old think, that is not the way to think of things. And this technology is evolving and you have to keep changing how you think of something as important. Apparently
Yeah,
this,
and I think
this is a
Mhm.
block.
Yeah, and I think the target of 110, like sometimes that gets stuck with people from like traditional pumping, and you're using that to try to get to that number. But I don't know, just like the intricacies of the algorithm, it doesn't always mean that that's where you're going to sit.
Okay, that's
It's
great.
very
Thanks.
fluid.
Mm.
So,
Thank you.
so this one, we're going to go to monitoring and devices, questions in that realm right now. And is a separate non-phone PDM required? Is there no app to use on the phone? This person does not want to have a second device.
You have to have either, you have to have a PDM or a supported Android phone. So they have a small list on their site, which I think is all Samsung's. And so if you want to use that, you can use that as your phone. But if you want any other phone as your primary phone, then you have a second device, be it the Omnipod PDM or a Samsung supported phone. My daughter's an iPhone user. She carries the PDM. People think it has to be in range. It does not. It's only for issuing instructions. The pod to sensor communicate or transmitter communication handles all of the work going on, the adjusting, the suspending, the increasing. So my daughter carries the PDM, and then we bought off eBay a used Samsung as a backup device.
And that leads into another question.
Before you jump,
Oh.
just to clarify, you need an Android phone, even if you use an iPhone. Do you need to turn on a phone number with that? Or is
No.
it? Okay.
No,
It needs our backup device does not have cell service. The only thing it needs Wi-Fi for would be to upload to Gluco. I can't think of anything else it would need connectivity for.
That's great.
Yeah.
because you can leave the Dexcom app. If you use an iPhone as your main phone, you can leave the Dexcom app on that phone and just use an Android phone or the controller essentially to do the controlling of the pod. And really all that's needed is bolusing, issuing manual corrections, or changing pods. Everything else is all the automation. You don't even need that. It can stay in your purse. You don't even have to go. You can go to the grocery store and leave it at home, unless you're planning to bolus while you're there. So the Dexcom app can stay on the iPhone, and you could use an Android, or you could use an Android for your daily phone, put both Dexcom and iPhone and Omnipod apps on that, and not have to carry two devices.
And I know this question is going to come up then because you're talking about devices. Is there a watch that is an Android watch where you can get your readings? Any chance for an Apple Watch that anyone's hearing?
Just a Dexcom, it would be the Dexcom compatible app. There's nothing Omnipod 5 for watch in any way that I can think of.
My son is a swimmer, and we can't get, so there's been some discussion about whether there's connectivity underwater. And I have put, we've seen that we can get it, and then other times we can't get it. And I've even put the devices right next to each other, and it's been kind of random whether we got it there by doing that or not. But we would put the controller at the end of the lane that he's in, and when he would stop into the lane, he would pop up and let it get a reading and then keep swimming. So that's been really nice to have, so that we could get readings easier too, because again, the pump and the Dexcom keep in connection.
I want to explain that a little more in case people didn't grasp how awesome that is. So traditionally, your Dexcom only connects to your phone once every 5 minutes. And if you miss that millisecond connection because they're out of range, in her case, because he's in the water, you have to wait another 5 minutes. And then she has to hope that he's out of the water for those milliseconds the next 5 minutes. So what you end up with, Tina, when her son's swimming, me when Lily's out on the field hockey field away from her phone, what you end up with is basically the whole time you have no readings in the Dexcom app because it's always out of range. Because the Omnipod is talking directly to the transmitter on the body, the Omnipod itself has all those saved numbers. So when you connect with the controller, it's almost immediate. So as soon as he comes out of the water, as soon as Lily gets close enough to the Omnipod 5 PDM controller, I see it usually takes maybe 10 seconds for it to pop up and have all of the readings that were there when it was out of range. So you don't have that 5 minute cycle of waiting until the next time it pings the phone.
Yeah.
And kind of that leads into the thought of like, in theory, there is the option to have, like, especially a lot of people think for pediatrics, to have like a parent phone be the Dexcom start and stop, and then have the child just have the controller. And in theory, you can see blood sugar information without having that phone nearby for that reason. But we always like to caution people about that, because you do not have, outside of an urgent low, you have no notifications of highs and lows, no information about like sensor errors. Like, you don't know, if there's no reading, you don't know why. It doesn't tell you why on the controller, and you need the phone to be able to share that information. So yes, could you do it with just the controller and having starting and stopping on a completely different device? You can, but it's not probably the safest thing to do for your child or the T1D.
Good info. Great info. All right, are we ready to go to the next? All right. I assume this means remotely, but can you monitor TDD and IOB and what's going on? And can you monitor via Night Scout?
No clinic, no blood sugar, no pump related data in Night Scout. It's all in Gluco, and it's it's a couple hours delay. What John and I have noticed, the lag is longer in the phone app than on the website. I don't know if the delay is documented exactly how long it is, but it's a couple hours.
Yeah. And I see that varying if the controller is on Wi-Fi versus on cellular, that it uploads at different time periods. I will clarify, you can get bolus and carbs showing in Night Scout. They have the same delay that Gluco has. If you're interested in that,
Guess
you can
what?
go to my
Sorry.
you can go to my GitHub page. It's github.com/Jon Fawcett, JONFAWCETT, and look for the Gluco Bridge repository. Reach out if you have questions about setting that up.
I knew there was a dormant project on that. I did not know it was. Did you pick up that old project?
There were 3 or 4 old ones that I found, and I played with each of them to figure out what worked and what didn't work. So the one that's in my repository is actually one that's working today.
There are a lot of people who have asked in various groups about that. So I didn't know if you were. I was unaware you did that, but cool. But it's straight from Gluco, so it's obviously not going to be any quicker than what's in Gluco. It's not just for anybody watching this. It's not from the device. It's a bridge from Gluco.
Let me point out there is actually one way there's one way to see real-time data that I'm aware of, and that is to use Gluru. So the caveats are you have to be using the Android phone. You can't be using the controller. And then you install Gluru on the Android phone. The parents, caregivers can have Gluru installed in theirs. It has all kinds of other cool features you can look up, but Greg has found a way to get some real-time data synced to show in Gluru. And since basically Gluer is Night Scout compatible, you'd have to check with them, but I think you can basically use any of the other Night Scout API type of apps like Loop Follow to then pull it into that in, from what I understand, real time.
Well,
All right, there are a lot of questions about pod Dexcom proximity on the body. Do they really have to be on the same side of the body? Is it impossible for people who are larger? What are y'all's takes on that?
My daughter follows no guidelines whatsoever and puts them wherever she feels like putting them, and we've never had communication issues. So that's us.
Same here.
But we're also
I-
dealing with a small child.
Well,
I
does
saw,
it have to do with how tall and rangy you are as opposed to how small as a child you are? Is it proximity that way?
It's like you're a bigger bag of water, essentially. And since it can't transmit through water well, if there's water in the way, so to speak, that can block that communication from happening. So in theory.
It's Bluetooth, right? I mean, it's still Bluetooth.
So my tip on that is to try doing what we did. I mean, Reese has worn like both on his arm. His arm is not huge, but we've put both on his arm or both on his tummy, close to each other, and it's worth giving that a shot.
Lily almost exclusively is one on the back of her left tricep and one on her right tricep. And I see so many people that for some reason it seems like people think a side is left or right, but I told Tina one day, I said, humans are just squishy squares, front, right, left, back. So on the backs of both arms is still on the same side. It's on the back. So I see very few people that are posting that they're having communication issues, no matter where they put the pod in the Dexcom.
My daughter's, she's probably worst case scenario as far as placement too, because she wears her sensors on her inner thigh. And so that's obviously 10 days. And then the pod is going back and forth between an upper arm, left and right. So, I mean, she's not following anything, and we've never had, any significant, if any, signal drop.
Yeah, I would say try it. And if you're finding that you're constantly in limited mode due to lack of communication, then maybe that's not a good place for your particular, body type.
Device. Yeah.
What is the guideline from Omnipod?
It's pretty limited. It says same side,
Yeah.
and the pictures seem a little misleading on, well, they have to be like here and here, both like right there. But I see people posting all over the place, like the four of us have said, and seems very few that people have issues with it.
I mean,
I almost probably see as many people posting they have issues because they're sometimes too close. Like if they have them right on top of each other, I see people posting that they sometimes don't communicate.
if you think about Loop was getting across a room to a phone and back, and I mean, if it could do that, then it should be able to do this.
There were some issues with Loop on the original Riley links, and people put a second Riley link on the top of their headboard because if they rolled over and something was on the back and that the front, they were not getting connectivity.
Right.
Yep.
We'd been on Dev and Dash for 10 months at that point when we switched, and probably 10 times during that time, I went in my daughter's room in the middle of the night and took her phone and stuck it somewhere in her bed because she was all wrapped up in blankets and I couldn't figure out where the stuff was. And so I'm just cramming her phone in various spots in her bed, trying to get it to work. And I have obviously never had to do that with there's nothing to move. I mean,
we have to do crazy things, don't we?
And then keep in mind too that they're not going to show pictures outside of those FDA approved locations for Dexcom too. So a lot of people wear ARM for Dexcom, and that's not currently approved in US for the G6. Obviously, it is approved for G7. So they're not gonna be able to show you pictures of that as a way that it works because it's not technically approved for Dexcom. So
That's exactly right. This makes me think of the fact that there is actually a diagram in the controller where you can record where you've put the pod, which is a really cool feature. So, questions about unannounced carbs, bolusing, pre-bolusing, and fat and protein. What if somebody forgets to pre-bolus or bolus? How do you handle fat and protein? Those kind of, I think of those as kind of going hand in hand because sometimes fat and protein can sneak up on us later.
I mean, our fat and protein strategy for us is not changed, and it's not the clinical recommendation. It is, we dose normal and make a note of check on it in an hour, you know, and if we're running higher than expected, take some more insulin. That's our fat and protein. You know, we're doing good to get the carbs right. So, adding in the fat and protein.
Yep.
And I do see a lot of posts from people that eat lower carb, and it does seem like some people struggle. I think a majority of people that are traditional pump therapy or MDI that are low carb or even not low carb often cover fat and protein with higher basal. And it does seem, just from how many posts I see, that doesn't work as a strategy in Omnipod 5. So I do think it's good for people that if they are seeing these rises I think protein's usually like 2 to 4 hours, and then fat is later than that even. If you're seeing those rises after that in that timing after your meal, you most likely want to start looking at ways to dose and strategies to dose for fat and protein. A lot of people also post that they're upset because they can't do the extended boluses. We were only on Omnipod for a week and a half before switching to Loop. So we actually never did extended boluses. We never got into that habit. We just carried forward what we had done with MDI, which was straight out of sugar surfing, where you watch for those rises and then you hit it on the rise, like Matthew said.
We were on Omnipod for a long time before Loop, and you know, we were very, you know, I mean, you eat 3 different types of food, and we'd have all kinds of stacked bolus. Terrified when we first switched to Loop and how much these upfront boluses were going to be. I mean, we were like, there's no possible way. And but yeah, we switched strategies with Loop, and not a lot of extended boluses.
And another important thing that just crossed my mind about dosing for fat and protein is your body doesn't convert those consistently. So carbs are basically carbs. Carbs are glucose. So your body's using glucose for energy. If it doesn't have enough for the energy out of your carbs, it's going to start converting fat and protein. And the lower carb you eat, the more fat and protein it's going to use. But even that isn't always consistent. Like the first portion is going to be, I think protein is the first one your body tries to use. And then after that, it starts using fat. I mean, you can read about the keto diets for like ultra marathon runners and stuff. It's basically, that's the same thing. It's converting these other sources to replace your deficit in glucose used for energy. So the lower carb you are, odds are you're going to have to dose more for fat and protein than a traditional person that's having a big mix of carbs, fat, and protein.
Yeah. And do you want to mention what Lily told us the other night?
Yeah, so she dropped me the note that said sometimes she doesn't dose for 40 to 70 carbs. And Now I know why some school days she's skyrockets in the middle of the day. But while that's not a good thing, and I actually would never recommend people try that with Omnipod 5, don't try not dosing. The system apparently can handle it to a certain degree. Because she's pretty close to a little over a year from being out on her own, possibly going away to college, we try to be hands off. So we usually don't jump in and try and do anything until she's urgent high or urgent low. So I couldn't say if when she hits 250 from not dosing, if she goes in and adds a correction at times, or if Omnipod handles it at other times just fully on its own.
Yeah.
Is your urgent high 250?
In the day, it is. In the night, I think in the night I have it at 275, and the day I have it at 250. But hers is set much closer because the purpose is hopefully at night. Hers goes off when she's 200, not 250, and she's correcting sooner. And then mine goes off if she's still climbing and not correcting enough. So, we've kind of expanded where our alerts are over time as parents to let her handle it more on her own, as long as she's almost taking the approach, as long as she's in a safe, as long as she's not in like a dangerous zone of potentially like needing to go to the hospital immediately. We try to let her handle it whenever we can. That's tough. It's tough, but Matthew's comment from the other day was mistakes are easier to fix or something like that. It's true, because she'll have a time when she goes up to 250, 300 because she made a mistake or didn't dose correctly or whatever, but then 3 hours later, she's back in range, even below 110. And if you look at just that day by itself, like the worst of the worst days of making mistakes, her A1C might be between 6.5 and 7 for that day. Like, so it's not crazy levels that she's getting to, even though she's, not always dosing correctly or not always even dosing.
And she's probably not hanging out up there either, right?
Correct. So that's the huge benefit of Omnipod 5 versus Loop, was when those mistakes happen on highs, they're usually short-lived. She's usually back down in 3 hours-ish at the most. So there's no, it looks like a mountain peak, not a plateau. And Loop on those times would be a plateau at the top, where you might be 3 or 4 hours sitting at 250 and up. Now you're maybe 10 minutes, 30 minutes over that, and it's right back down.
Yeah, last night I got an alert. I guess it was a Dexcom share outage last night, and I got my daughter for whatever reason, she shot up to like 255 at like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I got a no data alert, and I didn't even, call me a bad dad, I didn't even go check on her because I was confident everything was going to be fine. And the outage was for quite a while, and I looked at it this morning, everything was fine.
Jon, so does that tell you that they have something in their algorithm similar to one of your patches, your switcher patches, that address the need at a higher rate?
I have noticed that Omnipod 5 does not shut basal off as rapidly when you're high as Loop does. Now it shuts basal off a lot when she's really lower in rate, like 80 and under. But if she's like 200, 250, we can even, and she'll frequently go in and give herself a correction. So her alert goes off, she gives herself a correction, not always just relies on Omnipod 5 to deal with it, but she'll give herself just dose a unit. And she actually did this last night. She dosed 1.5 units, maybe even 2. And it didn't shut basal off, where Loop would shut basal off immediately, unless you were using some of the patches. So I think it just something in their algorithm handles keeping basal on when you're higher much better than Loop did. But we have noticed probably my biggest frustration with Omnipod 5 is when you forget to pre-bolus or you don't bolus enough for a meal. So you have this quick rise. It's really tricky to figure out how much you need to dose at the top of that without having a low 3 hours later.
At the back. Yep.
So because it keeps basal on more readily, you can also overdo it and end up with a low 3 hours later.
Yeah, we have to be cautious. You give less.
So your correction bolus, you're finding you give less than what you would have with Loop?
If it's already
Working
tried
on it.
to deal with the rise, the unexpected rise, it's a little harder to, I've told my daughter the same thing. I'm like, no, don't, she's like, I ate 60 carbs and I forgot to do it. And then she'll click. I'm like, no, slow down. Don't put in 60 carbs now and dose for it. I'm like, think what would you do? Not what does it need to do? Use your own brain now, because, and my daughter will get frustrated and she's like, it's not making sense. And I'm like, well, you gave it an impossible situation. I said, no system can make sense of the fact that you've shot up 100 points and it doesn't know why. So it's trying to bring you down. And if you tell it you ate now, I'm like, so slow down. And so I've tried to explain to her that, no algorithm can handle what you're throwing at it right now, because it's already acted on the unexpected rise. And now you're telling it you ate.
Well, an example for us from last night, she dosed too little for what she ate. We were already in bed. She ate something, dosed, shot straight up through the roof. When I took a look at what it had dosed, so her normal basal, my estimate that it's using is somewhere around 0.1 to 0.15 every 5 minutes. So that's like a 1 to 1.5 basal, somewhere in that range per hour. It was dosing 0.3 or 0.35 for 30 minutes to an hour, somewhere in that range. I mean, it was dosing a lot. I calculated it. It dosed her about 2 units over and above what it would have calculated the basal at in that rise over an hour. So that's why you have to be cautious to know what the system's doing, and to know at least an approximate of how much you need how much it's doing every 5 minutes to keep you flat for basal. Because then anything over that, you can quickly look and see it's been really cranking on those extra doses. I need to cut back on the corrective dose.
And I also want to add on that, your total daily insulin is relatively accurate. Somebody who just flat out
Oh, Brittany, we're not hearing you.
doses.
We can't hear you at all.
Oh, that's. I'm not sure why.
Hard to catch up, but it was determined to play everything you said at about 10% correct. It was going to say it all.
So we thought that I think you said your TDI or your basal, what it thinks is probably accurate. Is that what you were saying? And then we didn't get anything after that.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yes. So yeah, basically like your TDI has to be relatively accurate in order for the system to be able to handle those rises with, delayed carb entries or forgetting to announce a meal or something like that. Like if you're never bolusing, you're not going to get that success because your TDI is going to be incorrect and it's going to take forever for it to kind of understand. If that makes sense.
So everything you're talking about, because I don't know the terminology in O5, is in automatic mode. There's another mode you can be in, and when would you do that?
I've never done it by choice. If the two devices aren't talking to each other, you go into limited mode. I guess then there's manual mode too. Is that what it's called?
Manual was
Yeah,
essentially dash.
Right.
Traditional pump.
Um,
The only time I've ever gone in a manual is if we're going to a Dexcom change and blood sugar was dropping. And I know that there's something that's going to be bringing it up, just because otherwise it's going to like kind of take on that whatever it was happening based upon the trend, that 60-minute prediction when there's no blood sugars. And so it might cut basal. So that's probably the only time that I've ever used manual mode. I don't know if you guys have experienced that at all.
I've never intended, like I said, I've gone to limited mode by, because of an issue once or twice, but I've never gone to manual mode on purpose.
Mhm.
Fell into there. So regarding sensitivity and things coming to speed on O5, a mom of a small child who has a lot of sickness, is in and out of sickness, ear infections and whatnot, is wondering if anybody has found a shortcut to speeding up the pod or the system's learning other than like consistently giving correction boluses.
No.
You do a reset.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about this. I think somebody had a question about, maybe how to determine your settings from loop also. So I think the both of these would apply, is figure out how much TDI you've been using when you're in good range. So if you're coming from loop, is look through your Night Scout reports. And if you're happy with your loop results, look at what the TDI is, divide it by 48. That's your starting basal to put in for the system. And for if you're just struggling, having consistent highs and needing to speed up the learning, is figure out how much extra you've been needing to correct to get in a range you want. Do a restart and factor that in your basal as the same restarting method. So you're essentially telling the system from the beginning, your TDI is this much higher than it was, the last time you started the system.
I want to put a plug in, well, and do that when you need rates to be higher, and then when you don't need that anymore, do it again. And I want to put a plug in for not letting these things control you or your life. You control them. These are all tools that we have to use. It means we don't have to go, we don't have to use the pod all the way to the end. We can stop it and put a new one on when we know that that would benefit us. And this is a great situation like that. And with Dexcom, we made a decision a long time ago when we knew that the sensor was going to expire and it was gonna happen in the middle of the day. I was like, I don't want that. I want it when he doesn't have any IOB and I don't have to deal with it. And so I started stopping it early in the morning and putting the new one on. So it's serving me, I'm not serving it. And I just want to put a, really emphasize that we can do that.
But I have a question for you then, less to do with kids, although when they're sick, sickness happens quickly. For the older population, they have medical issues where they end up with steroids for a 5-day dose that's tapering. And so there's a constant adjustment in loop with overrides. How would you handle that in O5?
There is no increase override that you can strengthen insulin to carb or something like that, but there is no increase on the override. We just issue some corrections, and I don't know how aggressive and quick the learning is, but it's it seems to keep it in line within 12 to 24 hours, and then I said this on the earlier thing, we had the term underride in my household because of confusion about what a 70% override meant. So when we used to do a 30% underride, we now issue we change the target to 130 to 140. And right or wrong, I like that better because the system still understands this did this. Even though the target's higher, any algorithm learning is not going to be skewed because it still knows this much insulin did this. It's just we were shooting for a higher target and we came in a little lower. So,
and the one reason I like that better than loop strategy, for instance, the raised target, is I always struggled with loop because if she would have a low needs time period throughout the month, her carb ratio didn't always shift with that. So frequently by cutting the carb ratio back by 30%, she'd go high from that. So by only changing the target, you're keeping the carb ratio the same, but what it's actually doing is it's reducing the dose so that you're hitting this higher target, which gives you a safer bolus on the carbs, sort of the same as an override, but it's not really when you stop and look at the actual math. And I think Android APS pretty much solely everybody uses just target changes instead of sort of changing the percentages of all your settings.
Yeah.
So if you needed 100% extra insulin, which will happen with steroids, how would you do that?
Steroids is like a whole different beast. So I would say you would either need to go into manual mode with like significantly higher doses, or if you still want the benefit of the algorithm, that might be a time that you would do a reset with higher insulin needs. And then again, when you're kind of off of that, you could either set a really high target to be able to help, or if it's pretty extreme, the difference in what you're going to see, then you could again do a reset back to kind of what your normal TDI was pre-steroids.
So a reset
but
means
steroids
always
are pretty significant.
A reset is always changing pod.
Yes.
Yeah, a reset is basically literally starting from scratch. It deletes the history of the system understanding TDI, and then it goes back to being able to use like that first pod where it's using your basal system to determine the TDI.
So you always want to take
for the TDI.
You always want to take pictures before you do that. Pictures of your settings if you're going to want to return to them.
And don't forget though, they're in Gluco.
Or you could go to
under Gluco devices, and then you can pick the Omnipod 5. We tend to just dose more if that happens. Just go in and give yourself a correction.
Yeah.
And with Loop, we usually throughout the month would range from 70% at the lowest override to 120, sometimes 130 at the high end. Haven't really seen it any times that I remember where we've needed to do much different for the high end side of that. So it does handle a fairly large range. And there's only been maybe a few days where we've had to bump that target up. And it was when she was sick. We had to bump the target up because she was really low. But other than that, it's handled what we used to have to deal with by 70% to 120% overrides. So it handles that 90% of it completely automated now.
And on Loop, we were doing a 70 or 130% override each, average once a month. We've been on Omnipod 5 now for a little over 2 months. We have done the higher target one time, and that is it.
So speaking of a higher target, does anybody want to talk about activity mode, how we use that for activity?
Yeah, we had a override on Loop for typically 160 to 170 was the target. So that was, I equate that to activity mode. I don't know what activity mode actually sets the target to. Maybe somebody does.
It's 150.
150.
Okay. So we use them exactly the same way, being about 30 minutes before, hopefully maybe an hour before she goes to do cheer or whatever it is. The massive benefit being that she doesn't have to keep the phone with her. That was a big problem. I know there's some improvements in Loop with setting TBR that is persistent. I don't know how that works in this scenario, but it's worked fine for us. Especially with the phone.
Well, to tell people how it's used, when you pick it, it prompts you to pick how long.
Oh,
So
sorry.
you can pick by the hour, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, and then that actually saves that to the pod. So you can be out completely away from the controller, and it'll run for that time period and then automatically switch you back.
For us, for swim team, when I'm driving Reese to swim team, which is about a 15-minute drive, I'll turn it. I've got my eyes on what's happening, for quite a while before then. But depending on how much IOB he has and what his sugar is and everything, I might turn it on half an hour before practice, or I might turn it on the drive there. And then I let, readings when he's in the pool help me figure out what to do as far as turning it off before I set it for.
So you're assuming that exercise mode requires less insulin. There are people that get adrenaline rushes, and if they're playing pickleball, they need significantly more insulin. How would that work?
Well, that's how Lily was last year during field hockey. So she was still in Loop during the season, and she'd go out on the field. She'd lose all connection with Loop, usually lose Dexcom readings also. She'd start with, right at 100, and she'd come off the field at 300. And there were days when she would have 5 or 6 units on board and still come off the field high, but then have an absolute crash at the end of it. That's the biggest thing I've been looking forward to with Omnipod 5, but we started it during her off season. So I won't know how that works until she starts up again in the spring. But because they're constantly talking, I think the first thing we're going to try is to not actually use activity mode at all for her. Just try and let the system run and see, because I know now also when she's out in practice, her pod's going to beep if she's urgent low. So there's also that safety factor when you're exercising away from your devices, is your pod's going to tell you that you're urgent low.
Yeah, it's
A lot of beeping.
So it's gone well for us with cheer, which same thing, adrenaline, you never know in a competition. Is it up low? I mean, we've had massive fluctuations as she's about to go out onto the mat, and I'm sitting here cringing. I'm like, oh gosh, look at this. And it has been extremely stable so far.
We see, I guess, so Reese's practice has recently changed from about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes to 2-hour practices. And so we're having to relearn how to handle them. And a lot of times we're seeing what we believe is like gluconeogenesis from activity happening, and he's on the up towards the end of practice. So we'll get a number and then start actually bolusing him when he's still in the pool, still swimming, and then hit it really hard when he gets out if we need to.
Let me jump in and
you said the word.
Yeah, let me jump in and explain gluconeogenesis in case people don't know. It literally means creating new glucose. And that's what we were talking about earlier, where your body can convert fat, protein, even lactate, and a few other things into glucose. So that's all that term means, is it's basically your body using these other energy sources that you're not always necessarily dosing for or taking into account.
Yay. So what happens when Dexcom readings aren't happening? How does it work?
It goes on based on what the last reading was and what was happening. And just like, I mean, it doesn't have any more magic. I don't, maybe somebody else has more details to how long that can last or.
So
It
it's
has a
called
little more
automated
magic.
limited mode, right?
Mhm.
A little more magic in that I think it can run for up to an hour. Is that correct? Based on its last reading?
I think it continues on like for the prediction, and then it will flip into either delivering the adaptive basal rate or delivering the programmed basal rate, whichever is less insulin for safety. And then it'll continue to deliver that until Dexcom readings resume. So I think it starts off with continuing with the prediction, and then after a certain amount of time, it hard stops to one of those two for safety reasons.
But
I just don't know exactly
Matthew
how
said
long.
earlier, there was a Dexcom share outage. He didn't know. He rolled over. He went back to sleep. We had either her phone died or she accidentally closed the Dexcom app. Something happened, and we weren't getting readings in the middle of the night. I looked at it. I did the same thing. I rolled back over and I went to bed because I usually don't think about times anymore when she doesn't have readings, either from sensor warm up or errors or loss of, the phone dies or something. We just let the system run, knowing that it is still doing its job for the most part.
Mhm.
We've had it happen, and I'm like, not sure what's going to happen, but he's still running. So, let's see. All right, well, let's go to, has anyone had to do an injection? This person asked about with the pods on. And we have done plenty of those. I'm not sure whether we did any with 05 on or not.
The only time we've ever done it is if we have like a failed pod situation. So just to be able to help have it not think that there's more IOB than there actually is. Like when we've had it before where we've bolused for a meal and then all of a sudden realized that the cannula was never under the skin. So to be able to help ease that transition a little bit, we typically will do an injection to kind of make up for that, just to be able to help, since you can't, you don't want to falsely assume that higher amount of insulin, because then they might suddenly stay high. But it's not very often that would happen.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if Lily ever has or not. We've mentioned to her a few times that she might need to, but she's mostly independent, so I don't know if she has or not, but I'm pretty sure if she did, that she didn't do anything other than give herself an injection and carry on her day. And there weren't any like crazy lows that I know of after her doing that.
Yeah. So what types of insulin are our kids on? Matthew's is on insulin aspart. Mine's on Fiasp.
Novolog, which is
We're on,
aspart, right?
yep, when we're on Humalog or Lispro.
Okay.
We are going to talk to the endo next week about Afrezza as a supplement for times when she either forgets to pre-bolus, doesn't have time to pre-bolus, or just ridiculously crazy fast food. So we'll maybe have more information on that to share later.
Mm-hmm.
Great. That'll be awesome. What about diluted insulin? Have you heard of anybody using that?
What is that?
It's like for young kids where a unit goes, a long way. Brittany?
Yeah, we have not had anybody that I'm aware of that using that, or I've not heard of anybody, but I have heard of people using off-label U200 successfully.
Awesome.
Again, off-label. It's not approved in the pump at all. It's all off-label, just like the ultra rapid actains are off-label.
Okay. Here's what I think is a really great question. Do you find it necessarily to do standard pumping before going on Omnipod 5? As in, would you suggest that in lieu of putting somebody right on O5, coming out of the hospital?
That's a loaded question.
I know. I think it's tricky because it could potentially put you into false thinking and may set you back on the system. But at the same time, like understanding the basics of insulin action is huge. So I think that there's pros and cons to each. I know so many people did start off straight into loop, and their thought processes with starting straight into loop was they had better success because they didn't have that mentality of traditional pump to kind of break through those stereotypes. So I don't know.
And Loop has an incredible support system with Loop and Learn that people could go out and ask any questions and get guidance they want for anything. And Omnipod 5 has their own training, and it's in a lot of ways, I think the most important question is not should people do another pump or MDI or something other first before Omnipod 5. It's should people have more training about the underlying details of diabetes management in general, like Britni said, duration of insulin action, why that's important, what it means, how it changes IOB, what IOB means, like all of that. And I think for us, Lily's first pump was Dash, it was the original Eros. Her first pump was Eros, and she was on it for a week and a half or so before we started looping. But we were in the Shift Facebook group, sugar surfing, kind of, in many ways you could call it winging it for dosing, but that's winging it based on those millions of data points that are in your brain rather than just doing this rudimentary math. And I think that allowed us to be more successful at Loop. So I think the more training like that people can get, knowing how to dose on rises on their own without just this sliding scale correction factor. I think that's more important than being on a pump necessarily.
Yeah. I think they, even if they do go, come out of the hospital on O5, I think having a plan B on paper is a really good idea. So
as someone who started pump therapy 3 weeks into diagnosis, while that was beneficial due to the really small insulin needs and kind of on border of needing, I definitely feel like it took us a little bit longer to fully grasp insulin action, being on pump as opposed to injections. I think we would have been able to, I don't know. I feel like we had a little bit of a setback from that. Now we obviously strived to gain that information and that knowledge. And so it kind of really depends on the person and extent of that. But I think there's some advantage to fully understanding insulin action first.
Yeah. And I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect. When you're trying to get over something, the results don't have to be perfect. They just need to be safe, and I think that, embracing that requires a mind shift set for a lot of people, including me. Because of the long-term goal of, low and tight. And what I really want is safe and healthy and happy. And I think there's a really good opportunity to have that with both of these systems. So do you want to do a couple more questions, or?
I do have to leave. I'm like late for my next appointment, so I do need to head out, but going forward.
All right. Well,
All right.
thank you. Thank you, everybody. I hope this will be a really great resource. I know this will be a really great resource for Omnipod 5 users or want to users.
Mhm.
Thank you, everyone. You did a great job. There's going to be so much information that people did not have. You guys are such amazing experts and you really shared beautifully. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne.